Most gardeners don't realize they're stuck in a loop until they've been in it for years. You buy fertilizer, you spread it, plants green up for a while, then growth slows, leaves pale, and you're back at the store buying more. The problem isn't that fertilizer doesn't work. The problem is where it goes. Nitrogen is the biggest leak in the system. You apply it, and a large portion never reaches plant roots. Rain washes it down past the root zone. Sunlight volatilizes it back into the air. Soil microbes burn through it quickly if organic matter is low. What looks like feeding plants is often just feeding loss. Even organic fertilizers follow the same pattern. Fish emulsion, pellets, blood meal. They all depend on soil biology to slow-release nutrients. When that biology is weak, inputs disappear just as fast as synthetic ones. You're still buying nitrogen over and over, just in a different package. This creates dependence, not because gardeners are careless, but because the system is designed around constant replacement instead of regeneration. Fertility becomes something you purchase, not something you grow. Here's the part most people miss: nitrogen itself isn't scarce. It makes up most of the air around us. The real issue is access. Plants can't use atmospheric nitrogen directly. Something has to convert it first. Once you see that the question changes, instead of asking what fertilizer should I buy, you start asking what system can pull nitrogen in continuously without washing away. That's where the story actually begins. Nitrogen feels expensive because we only see it when it's packaged and sold. But in reality, nitrogen is everywhere. Nearly 80% of the air you're breathing right now is nitrogen. The problem is that plants can't touch it in that form. They're surrounded by it and still starving. Plants only use nitrogen after it's been converted into specific compounds. That conversion doesn't happen by itself. It requires biology. Microbes, bacteria, fungi, and a few specialized plants do the work. When those systems are missing or weak, nitrogen stays locked up no matter how much you apply. This is why soil condition matters more than fertilizer type. Healthy soil slows nitrogen loss. Depleted soil lets it leak away. Most modern gardens fall into the second category. Years of tilling salts and quick inputs strip out the living systems that once handled nutrient flow naturally. Industrial fertilizer bypasses biology by brute force. It floods the soil with soluble nitrogen and hopes roots catch it in time. Sometimes they do, often they don't. What's missed becomes runoff gas or groundwater pollution. Natural nitrogen systems work differently. They don't dump nutrients all at once. They generate small amounts continuously in sync with biological demand. That's slower on paper, but far more efficient in practice. Most gardeners only hear about legumes when nitrogen fixation comes up. Beans, clover, peas. Those work, but they still rely on soil contact and time. There's another path that skips soil entirely. Some plants fix nitrogen above the ground directly from the air, without waiting for roots or nodules. They don't feed soil first. They manufacture nitrogen on the surface and deliver it ready-made. Once you understand that distinction, it becomes clear why certain plants don't fit neatly into modern gardening rules, and why one of the fastest nitrogen generators on Earth doesn't grow in soil at all. Azolla is not a miracle plant. It doesn't heal soil by itself, and it doesn't break the laws of biology. It's a small floating fern that lives on the surface of still water. That's it. The reason it matters has nothing to do with folklore or tradition. It matters because of how it works. Inside the leaves of Azolla lives a microscopic partner, a cyanobacterium. This organism does the real work. It pulls nitrogen straight out of the air, and converts it into ammonia, a form plants can use. Azolla provides shelter and sugars. The bacteria provide nitrogen. It's a closed system, and it's extremely efficient. This partnership doesn't depend on soil. It doesn't need roots digging through beds or nodules forming underground. Everything happens at the surface, exposed directly to air and light. That's why Azolla moves so fast compared to cover crops or compost. When conditions are right, warm water enough, phosphorus and light shade, Azolla doesn't grow gradually, it multiplies. The surface area doubles in days, not because it's aggressive, but because the system isn't bottlenecked by soil processes. This is also where people get confused. They hear doubles every 3 days and assume it's a gimmick. It's not magic, it's simply uninterrupted nitrogen fixation happening in open air. But speed alone doesn't make something useful. Plenty of fast-growing plants are poor fertilizers. What matters is what that growth turns into once you remove it from the water. To understand why Azolla actually works in a garden, you have to look past how fast it grows and focus on what happens when it hits the soil. Fast growth gets attention, but growth alone doesn't feed plants. What matters is what that growth is made of and how it behaves once it leaves the water and enters the soil. This is where Azolla separates itself from most green material gardeners use. Its carbon to nitrogen ratio sits around 10:1. That number matters. It tells you how microbes will react when the material breaks down. High carbon inputs like straw wood chips or dry leaves force microbes to steal nitrogen from the soil just to decompose them. That slows plant growth before it helps it. Azolla does the opposite. Because it's low in carbon and high in nitrogen, microbes don't have to borrow anything. They break it down immediately. Nitrogen is released fast, often within 1 to 2 days, in warm soil. There's no waiting period and no temporary nutrient lockup. This makes Azolla closer to a fresh green manure than compost. But unlike cover crops, you don't need weeks or months of growth in a bed. The nitrogen is already fixed and stored in the plant tissue. When you harvest it, the work is done. That's the real advantage. Not the speed of growth in water, but the speed of release in soil. However, this speed also means Azolla has a narrow window of use. It's not a slow feeder. It won't carry crops through an entire season on its own. It delivers a quick hit of nitrogen, then it's gone. Used correctly, that's powerful. Used blindly, it creates imbalance. Understanding that difference is what keeps Azolla from becoming just another short-term fix instead of a reliable tool. Fast nitrogen is useful, but only in specific moments. This is where many gardeners get it wrong. They hear instant nitrogen and start using it everywhere. That's when problems show up. Azolla works best when plants are actively growing and clearly nitrogen hungry. Leafy greens, corn, tomatoes, and early vegetative growth squash. Before flowering, these crops can use a sudden nitrogen release efficiently. They're already pulling hard from the soil. Azolla meets that demand without delay. Where it backfires is late in the season or on crops that don't want excess nitrogen. Root vegetables can fork or grow tops at the expense of roots. Fruit crops can delay flowering. Perennials can push soft growth that doesn't harden before cold weather. In those cases, fast nitrogen weakens plants instead of helping them. There's also a soil side effect. Repeated heavy applications of quick nitrogen favor fast bacteria over slower fungal systems. Over time, that can push soil biology in the wrong direction if nothing balances it out. Azolla is not harmful, but it is directional. It pushes growth fast and shallow. This is why placement matters. Azolla belongs on the surface or lightly incorporated, not buried deep. It's a signal feed, not a foundation input. Think of it as a tool for correction, not maintenance. Use it when plants stall, pale, or need a push. Don't use it just because it's available. The goal isn't maximum growth. The goal is controlled growth that plants can support. Once you see Azolla this way, its role becomes clear, and so does why it clashes with systems built on uniform, one-size-fits-all inputs. Azolla didn't become a weed because it stopped working. It became a weed because it stopped fitting the system that replaced it. Modern agriculture depends on predictability and control. Inputs are measured, timed, and sold. Fertility comes in bags with guaranteed numbers and application charts. Azolla doesn't follow those rules. It grows when conditions are right, slows when they aren't, and reproduces without permission. That makes it difficult to manage at scale. A plant that fixes its own nitrogen and multiplies on its own doesn't need factory shipping or pricing. From an industrial perspective, that's not progress. It's a liability. There's also the issue of containment. In large water systems, Azolla spreads fast. Without constant harvesting, it forms dense mats that interfere with irrigation drainage and machinery. To a rice farmer managing by hand, that's manageable. To an industrial operation running pumps and channels, it's a problem. So Azolla was reclassified, not evaluated on usefulness, but on inconvenience. Once labeled invasive or undesirable, it disappeared from recommendations, extension manuals, and seed catalogs. That label stuck. Weed became shorthand for not profitable or hard to control, not useless. But the label isn't completely wrong either. A plant that grows this fast demands responsibility. Left alone in the wrong place, Azolla causes real damage. Understanding why it was rejected helps clarify how it should be used now, carefully, intentionally, and on a scale that stays under control. Azolla deserves respect, not praise. Its strength is the same thing that makes it dangerous when handled carelessly. In open water, Azolla doesn't just grow, it dominates. A dense mat blocks sunlight from reaching below the surface. Algae die. Oxygen levels drop. Fish and aquatic insects suffocate. What starts as a thin green layer can turn a living pond into a dead zone in weeks. This isn't theory, it's documented. Lakes, canals, and drainage systems have been damaged because someone treated Azolla like any other garden plant. Once it escapes into natural waterways, removal becomes expensive and disruptive. That's why regulations exist. Not to punish gardeners, but to prevent repeat damage. For home growers, this means one thing. Containment is non-negotiable. Azolla should never be grown in open ponds, ditches, rain barrels connected to runoff, or anywhere water can overflow into the environment. Buckets, tubs, and sealed containers are the right scale. Mesh covers matter, lids matter. Windbirds and heavy rain can all move fragments you didn't notice. Disposal matters too. You don't dump excess Azolla into drains or on bare ground near water. You dry it completely, compost it hot, or bag it for disposal. Living fragments survive longer than people expect. Using Azolla responsibly doesn't limit its value, it protects it. When kept contained, it's a controlled fertility tool. When released, it becomes a problem for everyone downstream. Stewardship is part of self-reliance. If a system can't be managed safely, it doesn't belong in a resilient garden. For home growers, scale is everything. Azolla doesn't need ponds, pumps, or infrastructure. In fact, the simpler the system, the better it behaves. A basic bucket setup works because it limits spread while keeping conditions stable. A 5-gallon bucket is enough to start. What matters more than size is surface area. Azolla grows across the top, not down into the water. Wide and shallow beats deep and narrow. Keep the water level a few inches from the rim so wind and rain don't splash material out. Use clean, dechlorinated water. Chlorine slows the bacteria that do the nitrogen fixing. Let tap water sit for a day, or use rainwater if it's collected safely and isn't connected to runoff. Before adding Azolla, add a small amount of garden soil or finished compost. This isn't about nutrients in general, it's about phosphorus. Without it, growth stalls and the fronds turn red. Light matters, but full sun doesn't. Bright shade or filtered sunlight keeps temperatures stable and prevents overheating. Ideal water temperature sits between about 68 and 82 degrees Celsius. Below that, growth slows. Above that, stress builds fast. No aeration is needed, no pumps, no filters. Still water is the point. Once established, the system mostly runs itself. Check water level, watch color, and harvest regularly. If growth slows, it's usually phosphorus temperature or light, not nitrogen. The bucket works because it keeps the system small, visible, and correctable. That's how Azolla stays useful instead of becoming a mess. Most problems with Azolla don't come from growing it. They come from not harvesting it correctly. Azolla grows exponentially. That sounds good, but exponential systems collapse if you let them run unchecked. When the surface gets too dense, light can't reach lower layers. Growth slows, fronds turn red or brown, and the system starts to rot instead of multiply. The fix is simple: harvest half every time. Removing about 50% of the mat resets the system. It restores light oxygen exchange and growth momentum. This isn't about squeezing out the maximum amount in one harvest. It's about keeping the system in a steady cycle that doesn't crash. If you harvest too little, the bucket stagnates. If you harvest too much, recovery slows and the bacteria lose their rhythm. Half is the balance point. Pay attention to color. Healthy Azolla is bright green. Red or purple tones mean stress, usually from low phosphorus cold water or too much sun. Pale yellow can mean nutrient imbalance or contaminated water. These are signals, not failures. Harvesting is also your main containment control. Regular removal prevents overflow fragments escaping or decay setting in. Every harvest is an inspection. Don't let Azolla pile up in the bucket unused. If you're not ready to apply it, dry it completely. Wet storage invites breakdown and odor. A stable harvest rhythm turns a bucket into a predictable input, not a runaway system. That predictability is what makes Azolla practical instead of problematic. Azolla is most useful when you keep its role narrow. It does a few things very well, and it's average or poor at everything else. Trying to make it do more than it's suited for is where disappointment starts. The first use is direct soil application. Fresh Azolla spread on the soil surface breaks down fast. Within a day or two in warm conditions, it melts into the top layer and releases nitrogen. This works best around heavy feeders that are actively growing. You don't need much. A thin layer is enough. Piling it on doesn't double the benefit. It just wastes material. The second use is compost activation. Azolla is excellent at waking up a slow pile. A small amount mixed into carbon-heavy compost leaves, straw, wood chips adds immediately available nitrogen. That jumpstarts microbial activity and raises temperature quickly. This is not a bulk ingredient. Think of it as an ignition source, not the fuel. The third use is liquid extraction. Soaking fresh Azolla in water for several days pulls out soluble nutrients. Diluted and applied to soil or leaves, it provides a gentle, fast-acting feed. This works when plants need a boost, but soil application isn't practical. What Azolla doesn't do is replace long-term soil building. It won't add structure. It won't supply minerals. It won't fix compaction. Those jobs belong to compost roots, mulch, and time. Used correctly, Azolla fills short gaps in fertility. It keeps growth moving when nitrogen is the limiting factor. That's valuable as long as you don't ask it to be more than it is. Azolla is effective because it's specific. Problems start when people expect it to do jobs it was never meant to do. Azolla does not rebuild soil structure. It breaks down too fast. There's not enough fiber or complexity in the material to create lasting aggregates. If your soil is compacted, crusted, or drains poorly, Azolla won't fix that. You still need roots, mulch, and time. It does not replace minerals. Azolla supplies nitrogen and small amounts of trace elements, but it doesn't bring in calcium, potassium, magnesium, or phosphorus at meaningful levels. If those are missing, growth will still stall. Nitrogen only works when the rest of the system is in place. It does not create long-term fertility on its own. Because it releases nutrients quickly, its effect is short-lived. Think days, not months. That's fine when you need a push. It's not a foundation for the whole season. Azolla also doesn't work in dead soil. If microbial life is absent or heavily damaged, nutrients released from Azolla won't cycle efficiently. They'll leach or volatilize just like bagged fertilizer. Biology still matters. Finally, Azolla doesn't scale endlessly. It's best used in small controlled systems. Trying to turn it into a universal solution leads back to the same mistakes industrial systems made. Understanding these limits doesn't weaken Azolla's value, it sharpens it. When you know exactly what a tool can and cannot do, you stop misusing it and you start getting consistent results. Azolla isn't better than every other nitrogen source. It's different. The value comes from knowing when it makes sense compared to the options most gardeners already use. Legumes fix nitrogen in soil through root nodules. They're slow, steady, and tied to the season. Clover, peas, beans, they work well when you can dedicate bed space and time. The payoff comes later. Azolla delivers nitrogen immediately, but doesn't build reserves. One is a savings account. The other is cash flow. Manure provides nitrogen plus organic matter, but it's bulky and inconsistent. Nutrient levels vary, and timing matters to avoid burn or runoff. Azolla is lighter, cleaner, and more predictable in small amounts, but it doesn't add bulk or structure. Compost is balanced and safe, but slow. It feeds soil more than plants. That's its strength. Azolla feeds plants first. Used together, compost handles the long game, while Azolla handles short-term demand. Synthetic fertilizer is fast and precise, but it bypasses biology and leaks easily. Azolla matches its speed without the salt load or dependency, but it still relies on living systems to finish the job. Each strategy has trade-offs. There's no single winner. Azolla fills a narrow gap, fast renewable nitrogen with minimal input. When gardeners stop asking which method is best and start asking which method fits the moment, systems get simpler and more resilient. Azolla doesn't ignore climate, and neither should you. In most of North America, it's a seasonal tool, not a year-round system. Azolla grows best when water stays warm. Once temperatures drop below about 60 degrees, growth slows sharply. Below 50 degrees it mostly stalls. In many regions, that means active production runs from late spring through early fall. That's fine. That's also when gardens need nitrogen most. Trying to force winter growth usually costs more effort than it's worth. Indoor buckets need strong light and steady warmth. For most gardeners, that energy is better spent building soil planning rotations or maintaining tools. In cold climates, the simplest approach is preservation. Dry harvested Azolla completely during the growing season. Dried material stores well and can be added to compost later or rehydrated for use when soil warms again. It won't be as fast as fresh, but it still carries nitrogen. If you do overwinter a live culture, keep it contained small and stable. A sunny window insulated container and clean water are enough. Don't chase speed. Survival is the goal. Spring restart is easy. Once water warms, growth returns quickly. A small starter becomes productive again in days. Seasonal use keeps Azolla in balance with the garden. It's not meant to replace natural cycles. It works best when it moves with them, not against them. Azolla doesn't make you independent by itself. What it does is give you another option, one that doesn't rely on a store shelf or a supply chain. That distinction matters. Independence isn't about cutting everything else out. It's about not being cornered. When fertilizer prices jump or availability drops, a small system that keeps producing nitrogen quietly in the background changes your position. You're not scrambling, you're choosing. This is where Azolla fits best. Not as a replacement for compost manure or good soil practices, but as a pressure valve. When growth stalls, you have a way to respond. When a crop needs a push, you don't have to guess or buy. Small systems are easier to manage, easier to stop, and easier to correct. A bucket can be dumped dried or shut down in minutes. That matters. Systems that can't be turned off become liabilities. Azolla also encourages attention. You see it every few days. You harvest it by hand. You notice color, smell, and change. That feedback loop keeps you engaged with the process instead of detached from it. This isn't nostalgia, it's practical resilience. Old methods lasted because they worked at human scale. They didn't require constant expansion or oversight. Azolla won't save a bad garden, but in a well-managed one, it adds flexibility. And flexibility is what keeps systems functioning when conditions shift. The goal isn't to replace modern tools, it's to avoid needing them all the time. Azolla matters now for the same reason it mattered before fertilizers came in bags. It turns something free into something useful quietly and continuously. Input costs rise, supply chains break, products disappear or change quality. None of that stops the need for nitrogen. Plants don't care about market conditions, they care about access. Azolla bypasses the market entirely and goes straight to the source. This isn't about abandoning modern gardening, it's about reducing exposure. When one input fails, another carries the load. That's resilience in practice, not theory. Azolla also reminds us that efficiency isn't always industrial. A system doesn't have to be large to be effective. It just has to match its environment and be managed correctly. A bucket producing steady nitrogen week after week can outperform a shelf full of products if you use it well. There's no hype here. Azolla won't fix everything. It won't rebuild soil on its own. It won't replace good management, but it will keep feeding plants when nitrogen is the limiting factor, without waste and without dependency. That's why it's been misunderstood. Systems that generate abundance without control make people uneasy. But in a garden, control doesn't come from ownership or packaging. It comes from attention. Used carefully, Azolla isn't a weed. It's a tool, one that's been tested, measured, and proven wherever people needed fertility more than convenience. And that's why it still works now.